Titans have a very interesting place in the meta right now. They have some of the worst gun damage capabilities out of all three classes. However, they can more than make up for it with their healing and also their melee damage abilities. Currently, we actually have two very potent melee-based builds on Titan in Strand and also Solar, both using Synthoceps because that exotic is just insane. And hey, why not buff it next season and also give it handling, right? Great stuff, Bungie. So let's go ahead and have a look at how you can unleash this destructive power yourself. First up, we're going to be having a look at Strand Titan. This is by far the most powerful thing, and it became this season because of the aspect Banner of War, and we're going to be talking more about that later. But for now, let's look at the Strand kit as a whole. On Titans, we have the barricades. These are relatively useless in PvE. The rally barricade has a shorter cooldown and can be used for things like bomber, so I like to use it. And it also gives you a nice reload and other stats bump whenever you're behind it, so sometimes it might be useful in some sort of weapon damage situation, but reality is there's much better alternatives. This is just kind of like a last resort. You can also use Towering Barricade if you're in a harder activity and it might actually be useful to block bullets or pick up a res or something like a GM. You might use it there, but the Barricade is probably the weakest out of all the class abilities as far as PvE goes. Then we have the Jump. Pretty much the second best jump in the game behind Warlock, I'd say, for PvE. The Warlock just has way better speed carrying. However, as far as like a consistent and safe jump, Titans have it, they're number one in Catapult Lift. Some people like to use Strafe Lift. They think it goes faster. It actually doesn't. So I definitely recommend Catapult Lift and just getting used to it because it is by far the best jump. And for the melee, we have quite a few options here, but I think that we're going to go with Frenzied Blade as our choice. We get to have 3 of these, and they get to do some obscene damage when we start stacking up melee damage. This is actually a crazy melee ability. And we're going to be using Grapple. This is basically just another melee because why not? And it actually gets all the benefits of melee damage and melee effects, and it even uses momentum transfer to actually give you back your grenade whenever you use the Grapple melee. It's insane. Now let's get on to the real unique parts of the Titan in the aspects. We're going to be using a mix of Banner of War and Into the Fray. Into the Fray says whenever you get Woven Mail, you will get really high increased melee regeneration rate, and Destroying Tangles also gives you Woven Mail. So Woven Mail is not only an insane amount of damage resistance on you whenever you have it, it is now also giving you an absurd amount of melee regen, and this is actually very noticeable, especially whenever you have multiple stacks, because whenever you have a ability which can have multiple stacks of them, it regens faster as you have more stacks. So if you have 2 stacks already and you're recharging the third, you will get increased regen rate compared to if you only had 1 or 0 and you were recharging the first or second. This is important because whenever you multiply different sources of increased ability regen rate, they go very, very fast, and you can see a great example of this on something like the Stasis Hunter, where you use the aspect that gives you back grenade energy regen whenever you smash a crystal, and you also use something like Frosty's, or you're in a strike with the lightning crystals or anything like that. Anything to increase the regen rate, it becomes very noticeable whenever you start multiplying the effects. And finally, we have Banner of War. Let's go ahead and just read through this because there's actually a lot to it. So you defeat a target with a melee attack, a finisher, or a sword. This also includes glaives, using both the melee and actually the projectile as well, even though that's not mentioned. And you will get the Banner of War, which is basically a big circle that follows you around and gives out energy pulses that give healing. While you're in the circle, yourself is always in the circle, and your teammates too, will get increased melee damage and sword damage as well. You get multiple stacks by just killing things with Banner of War, and it makes the healing faster, but this doesn't actually affect the damage at all. Now the beauty here is that your teammates can actually kill things for you, and it will increase the duration of the Banner of War. So you can literally just be emoting and like messing around and doing nothing or AFK, and your teammates can just kill stuff and have infinite healing. But the real beauty for this in the melee build is the, of course, melee damage increase. As we know from looking at the Hunter builds, we know that whenever you stack a lot of different sources of melee damage, they multiply and get absurdly large, and Banner of War is no exception there. So we'll be combining, of course, Banner of War, 1-2 Punch, and Tractor Cannon, and we can also use Monochromatic Maestro this season for an additional 10% to abilities, and we can get an absurd amount of damage out of them. This ends up adding up to over 500,000 damage per melee, and don't forget that you have 3 of them. And also a grapple, which can be infinite by grappling to a tangle point, so it's a little bit absurd. Next up, we'll go over the fragment choice. There's a pretty specific set of fragments you want to use here. So we have Thread of Warding. This one gives you woven mail whenever you pick up orbs. It's just even easier to keep uptime up on your melees, that way you're always getting woven mail. Obviously you can use heavy-handed on your gauntlets to spawn orbs every time you get a melee, and then you basically get the charge back in a couple of seconds off of having woven mail with Into the Fray. This one is by far the least important. This is kind of the flex slot that you can just put whatever you want in. I went with this just to be able to pop barriers with my shotgun in case I wasn't able to just insta-kill them. But this one can definitely be switched out for anything else that you might prefer. Then we have Thread of Ascent. This one is just insane. You know, we have a very balanced fragment here. You know, you use your grenade ability, which, reminder, grapple can be used on a tangle, and you can just infinitely spam this, and it will reload your weapon and also give you handling and also give you reload and give you scalars to both. Super balanced. And we have Thread of Generation, of course, for just getting more grenades, more grapples, which means more melees, which means more grapple melees. So it just all comes together into this super crazy build. Now, the Strand Titan setup is actually relatively weapon dependent, although it is not very ammo dependent, and you'll see what I mean by that. So first of all, the current best 1-2 punch shotgun for this season, because of Monochromatic Maestro, is going to be the Swordbreaker. This is because it is strand, so it matches elements, meaning that whenever you shoot the target with this, you get Monochromatic Maestro, which gives ability damage. So you're getting an extra 10% multiplicative damage buff on top of the 1-2 punch buff that you also got. 1-2 punch, of course, on a shotgun is a requirement for this setup, but any 1-2 punch shotgun will still do great things for you. You're also going to want to have yourself or a player on Tractor Cannon. That way you can debuff the target. If you're doing any kind of solo content, I recommend using Tractor Cannon and Swordbreaker as your go-to weapons. Very good stuff. And then I like to use an ag clear weapon. You could use any kind of waveframe or trace rifle you wanted, anything like that. You could use a primary if you really wanted to. The slot is pretty open. You could also just use another shotgun as either weapon damage or a second 1-2 punch shotgun if you're worried about running out of ammo. Next up, we have our exotic. This is going to be Synthoceps. Synthoceps, very important, yes. And we use heavy-handed, that way we get an orb every time we get a melee kill. And this does proc whenever you use the grapple melee to get a kill as well. So if you are planning to use the grapple melee primarily, make sure you're using heavy-handed and not firepower. Then I also like to use Impact Induction, giving us back grenade energy whenever we use our melee. That means that whenever we use any of our melee charges, we get back grenade energy, or whenever we use our grapple melee, we also get a bit of energy back for it as well, similar to a Kickstart mod, but without needing it. Then this one is kind of just a flex slot. You can kind of use whatever you want here, but I just like to use this to have a little bit of a quicker uptime on pulling the shotgun up. Other than that, we have really basic stuff on our gear, you know, just resistance mods, that kind of thing. So pretty simple setup, and it is amazingly powerful, and it is pretty much a top strategy for any low man or super hard content right now. And next up on our list is going to be Solar. Solar has a little bit more variety to it than the Strand setup right now. Solar is like the classic survivability subclass on Titan, but as of this season, they actually gave the super the ability to become a one-off super, making it actually a great damage super. However, in the same vein, they also ended up adding Banner of War, which brought this pretty far out of the meta, but this is still has much more survivability than Strand Titan does. However, it does come at the cost of being much more kill hungry and also doing quite a bit less DPS. I still recommend this for some solo content, and you could even use this as your go-to weapon damage subclass instead of Arc with the Pyrogales and not even focus on the Synthoceps. So this is going to be probably the most versatile class, however also the least specialized now for Titans. Anyway, going through, we've got the same choices for our wall jump. We have a lot of choices with the melee. We actually have 2 this time. We're going to be using the throwing hammer. The hammer strike is just worse than the hammer in every way for PvE. Then we use the healing grenade because the melee is so potent on Titan. The only exception to this is using fusion grenades with the gauntlets that give you better fusion grenades. And you could do that, but I mean, you could just invest nothing into the throwing hammer and it's pretty much just as good. So definitely recommend that if you're actually trying to go for a strong endgame build. With the aspects, we're going to go with Roaring Flame and Soul Invictus. Roaring Flames gives us increased ability damage, obviously very good for a melee build. And then we have Soul Invictus. Basically everything we kill spawns a sunspot, and these sunspots give us restoration, which is why this build is so insane and so good for survivability, because restoration is pretty much the best survivability thing in the game right now. And the beauty in this is that every single thing you kill drops a sunspot, and there's pretty much no cooldown, so you don't even need to use Ember of Empyrean. So here's the reason why I really like this build for weapon damage actually. We can use Ember of Torches. This is the main thing. This gives us Radiant, which is actually the same damage buff as a Well of Radiance. And if we kill an enemy with our hammer, it also drops a sunspot, which gives us restoration, which is not quite the same amount of healing and also doesn't give us damage resistance like Well of Radiance, but it still gives us quite a lot of healing, and it pretty much puts us into our own little mini well that we can spawn every time we get a melee kill. So this is insane for any kind of solo content, looking at Ghost of the Deep, especially Final Boss, where you can basically just kill one thrall with your melee, and then you have a 25% damage buff and a ton of healing, and you could just keep repeating that. You use it with a surrounded weapon, and you could do actually very good damage to the boss. Then I like to use the Mercy Searing combo. This is basically just a little way to get free restoration if you ever need it. You end up leaving these fire sprites around the battlefield after you kill things, and you can just go pick them up whenever you need healing. These are kind of optional because we don't really need a lot of fragment slots for the solar setup, so if you wanted to replace these with something else, you absolutely could. Then finally, I like to use Ember of Solace. Some people might like to use Ember of Empyrean instead to increase the duration of the timers even more. But what I found is that with the amount of kills that you need to maintain things like Roaring Flames anyway, I'm better off just getting another kill and resetting the timer back and just increasing the duration of the timer instead. So this is the build for pretty much everything on Solar Titan. However, we actually end up changing our exotics more to really change up the build. Using Synthoceps, the hammer will hit for pretty much over 100k every time, and you can just spam it. This is assuming you have Roaring Flames and Synthoceps active, obviously. 1-2 Punch doesn't apply to the ranged melee, so there's no need to have that. It's still a pretty good damage option. However, if you're looking at gun damage, especially if you're using maybe a solar weapon, I don't know, maybe Apex Predator, the best rocket in the game, you could use Pyrogills and have a super, which actually is very good as a one-off damage super. And the beauty behind it is that it is constantly doing take damage for a while, so you've actually got constant monochromatic maestro for quite a while applied to your weapons. And while that will no longer be the case next season, this is still a great thing regardless. It pretty much matches with Thunder Crash. It does a little less if you don't have Roaring Flames, and it does a little more if you do. So this is certainly a well-balanced setup now. Unfortunately, they did patch its interaction with Synthoceps, so you can't switch to Synthoceps after you pop the super using Pyrogills, but it still does very good damage regardless. Alright, and finally, we're going to be looking at Arc Titan. I know this thing has been an absolute curse in PvP for a while now, but in PvE, it is much less so. Arc Titan is pretty much another versatile subclass, except it is more for weapon damage, even more so than Solar is now, and it really doesn't have a very viable melee DPS setup like the other two. The main reason to use Thunder Crash is because it works on almost everything, whereas Pyrogills will not work on targets that move a lot or flying targets very effectively. Thunder Crash's big selling point is of course on Aatrax, where you only have like 1 second to deal damage. However, Arc does have a good number of things going for it for weapon damage setups. First of all, we're going to be using the same barricade and lift setup and all that. You do also get to use the thruster, and you could use that just to spam your class ability more and get more bomber procs. It's kind of up to you what you want to do. Next up we have the melees. These are all actually pretty good melees for PvE. I like to use Shoulder Charge just because it can blind a major and make them stop shooting at me, and it also just does decent splash damage still, although the Ballistic Slam of course has even more splash damage than that. As for the grenade, I like to use Pulse Grenades. They're pretty much on par with Storm Grenades at this point. And then we get into the aspects. Here we have Touch of Thunder, where the Pulse Grenades will give us Ionic Traces on hits, and the Storm Grenade will release a roaming thing that goes around and hits things. So this is why I actually chose Pulse Grenades, is because it helps you basically get grenade energy back on using your grenade, which is obviously a great thing to have. Then on the other hand, we have Knockout. Knockout is actually very good as an ag clear setup, because when you have Knockout procced, your uncharged melees count as charged hits and can do things like spawn orbs, and also of course have the increased damage. It'll also heal you on every melee kill. While this is nowhere near as powerful as having just Banner of War active for 30 seconds straight, or by getting restoration off of every melee kill you get on Solar, it's still noteworthy as something you can do for your neutral game while you're running this as a DPS setup. Next up, we'll look at the fragments, and we have like basically 2 fragments that are must-haves, and then the other 2 that are kind of just extras and you could switch out if you wanted to. The first one being Spark of Shock. This is pretty much just the best fragment in the game for Arc. There's no doubt, you use it everywhere. Jolting targets with grenades is absolutely amazing. Jolt still has very strong ag clear, and is still free damage, albeit not very much, in DPS. Then we use Spark of Resistance. This is the other must-have. This is 25% damage resistance by having enemies around you. You're playing a subclass that is basically designed to go around and punch things for the neutral game, so having damage resistance while you're doing so is amazing. Then these 2 are the optional ones. I like to use Spark of Amplitude. It's very easy to just spawn orbs very quickly using this. There is a bit of a cooldown, but you still just get free orbs, and you'll occasionally get double orbs if you're using the heavy-handed mod on your arms. Finally, we have Spark of Beacons. I mostly like this because you can pair it with Forbearance, and it will create blinding explosions along with the regular explosions, and it will just bring enemies that are attacking you to a complete halt. You could replace this with a number of options. A big one I would go for is Spark of Magnitude, which will make your pulse grenade last longer, which can give you more ionic traces. You could also go with one that gives you more ionic traces, like using Arc Weapon Final Blows, or defeating jolted targets. Both of these will be good, especially this one since it combines with the grenade, which will be jolting enemies and making ionic traces. It can make it even more. So we have quite a few options here. It's a great setup. I don't think Arc is specifically the most powerful for anything, but I think it is a great choice overall if you're stuck on a Titan and you need to do good weapon damage, especially in the rocket meta. It's definitely a good choice for sure. Anyway, that's going to wrap up things for the Titan build. If you've made it to the end, I do want to thank you for watching. I appreciate your support. I've had some absolutely amazing support lately. We've just hit 700 subscribers, so working towards that 1,000. Any support you could show is much appreciated. Like, subscribe, comments, share it with your friends, everything like that. Go ahead. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.